My name is Athena Moore, 32 years old, born and raised in a small suburban town near Greenville, South Carolina, where your family's reputation matters more than the truth. In our home, everything revolved around my brother, Brandon Moore, and I was just a faded shadow behind family portraits, always cropped just enough to leave me out. Brandon is 3 years older than me, and since preschool, my mother had called him the heir of the family. One time he won a bronze medal in a school spelling bee, and my mother had his photo printed on New Year's cards for every neighbor. And when I won first place in a statewide essay contest in 8th grade, she said exactly 6 words. "That's good, but don't get cocky." My dad, Frank, was a quiet man, a mid-level manager at a construction company. He wasn't a bad person, just someone who chose peace. When Mom spoke, he nodded. When Brandon needed something, he moved. And me? I learned to do everything on my own, because no one ever had time to look in my direction, not even for a moment. I still remember the day I was 10. I had spent 3 weeks drawing a landscape painting to enter into the state's children's art competition. When I got the letter saying I'd won first place and earned a summer scholarship to the Georgia State School of the Arts, I ran home with my heart pounding like a drum. I handed the letter to my mom. She glanced at it for about 5 seconds, then set it down on the kitchen counter without a word. She was busy slicing apples for Brandon. He had just lost the short distance race at school. I asked softly, "Mom, are you happy?" She didn't look up. "Sure, but you're not going anywhere this summer. I've signed you up for a math prep class." I choked. "But it's a scholarship. It's free. You need to learn something useful. Drawing won't get you anywhere in life." I didn't reply. The letter stayed on the table, stained with orange juice the next day, and disappeared soon after. No one ever mentioned it again. That pattern repeated like a habit no one wanted to break. When Brandon was in high school and failed biology, my mom went to the school crying, begging his teacher for another chance. When I got a perfect score in English and was nominated for a regional writing competition, she didn't go with me because she had already promised Brandon a baseball game that weekend. Our house was never short on noise, Mom bragging to neighbors about her son, Dad asking if Brandon was hungry after practice, and me, I could go to school, come home, lock myself in my room all day, and no one would notice. One time, I faked fainting in the bathroom just to see if anyone would care. Dad looked worried for a moment, then asked, "Are you stressed from exams? You should eat more." Brandon went through the same thing. Brandon, always Brandon. His name echoed like church bells every Sunday morning, steady, loud, and impossible to ignore. I tried everything to earn recognition, writing for the school paper, winning literature awards, volunteering during summers. But every time I spoke up, my mom would steer the conversation back to Brandon. "Brandon just got invited to a private college tour with the football team. And you're still doing that little magazine thing at school?" I learned a lesson earlier than most kids. In some families, fairness doesn't exist. Some children are born to be in the picture, and others are born to stand just outside the frame. And I was the latter. I discovered my talent for writing when I was 12, on a rainy afternoon during a power outage. I sat quietly by the window and wrote a short story using one of Mom's cheap grocery list pens. It was about a little girl who could hear the thoughts of flowers. It probably sounded silly, but I remember trembling as I wrote the final line. For the first time, I felt like I had touched something deeper than any word I'd ever heard in our home. I submitted that story to the county's youth writing contest. I didn't tell anyone. 6 weeks later, my teacher pulled me out of math class and handed me a letter from the principal's office. First place. The story would be published in the Southeast Youth Literary Collection. They even invited me to speak at the event in Charleston. I carried the letter into the kitchen where Mom was checking her email. "Mom, I've been chosen to speak in Charleston. They're covering all the expenses." She raised her eyebrows without taking her eyes off the screen. "What writing nonsense now? I have a meeting with Brandon's football booster club that weekend. No one has time to take you to some silly thing. I can go by myself. They've arranged a school bus for the participants." She stopped, looked at me as if I'd asked to paddle to Alaska. "By yourself? Who do you think you are? A kid who can't even take care of herself, talking about representing something? All those writing kids are just living in a dream world. You can't pay bills with poetry. I didn't respond. I just folded the letter and slipped it under my bed into a shoebox where I kept 3 handwritten manuscripts no one had ever seen. Throughout high school, I kept writing, not because anyone encouraged me, but because I couldn't stop. I wrote about people no one listened to, families without laughter, dinner tables where silence was saltier than soup. Whenever I got an acceptance letter or an invite to a conference, I hid it like a precious secret. Meanwhile, Mom bought Brandon a brand new DSLR camera to shoot sports vlogs, a hobby he abandoned after 3 months. I borrowed Grandpa's old computer to type my manuscripts for a student publisher. The machine was so slow it took a full minute to save a file, but I loved it. It was the only thing in the house that never judged me. The summer I turned 17, I secretly applied to a creative writing workshop at Duke University. I had to write a scholarship essay, submit 3 sample pieces, and forge a teacher recommendation because Mom refused to sign the application. I got in, with a full ride. When I told my parents, Dad only asked, "And what will you do with this? Become a writer? Writers don't get health insurance." I replied quietly, "Some people still make a living from writing." Mom slammed her coffee cup onto the table. "Write all you want, but don't expect us to pay for college just so you can chase fantasies. This family doesn't fund daydreams." I nodded. But I went anyway. Thanks to the full scholarship and some money I'd saved editing other students' essays, I made the trip. It changed me. For the first time, I sat among people who spoke the same language, of ideas, emotions, and dreams, unfiltered. One professor called me a linguistic prodigy. A small press in the state offered to publish my short story collection. I declined. I wasn't ready for the world to touch what still hurt. When I returned home, Mom didn't ask a thing. She was busy planning Brandon's celebration party. He had just gotten a scholarship to Clemson University's sports management program, even though he'd failed statistics 3 times. She baked cakes, booked photographers, and hung banners. I quietly packed my books, cleaned my room, and prepared to leave. I chose a college in New York, the farthest I could go. I studied literature and publishing. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for support. I didn't say goodbye. Because I knew, deep down, no one would feel like I was missing. I arrived in New York on a sweltering August morning, carrying exactly 2 suitcases, 1 backpack, and a sense of self that had been twisted beyond recognition by my family. The apartment I rented was a loft barely 400 square feet in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Peeling walls, creaky wooden floors, and rats the size of cats scurrying down the hallway every night. But to me, it was paradise, because no one here called me that girl who writes nonsense. I worked and studied. By day, a barista at a coffee shop on the corner of Broadway. By night, an unpaid editorial assistant for a fledgling independent publisher. Sleep was a luxury, but for the first time in my life, I felt alive, not to please anyone, but to reach something I truly believed in. A few months later, I called home to share that I'd been accepted into an internship at Paper and Bone, a long-standing literary magazine that had published many renowned authors. My mom responded dismissively, "A magazine? Does it pay?" I said no, but it was a rare opportunity. She scoffed over the phone. "See, moved to New York just to work for free and live on dry ramen. I told you, writing's romantic, but it doesn't pay the bills. Just wait, you'll come crawling back in 6 months." Dad didn't say much. He quietly asked if I needed money. When I said I was okay, he nodded and hung up. I didn't know if he believed me, but I was sure Mom didn't. They told the relatives I was doing something with paperwork in New York, as if I were a temp secretary somewhere near Chinatown. In the family Christmas card that year, my name wasn't mentioned. There was only Brandon, in a new suit, honor graduate in sports management from Clemson, with the caption, "So proud of Brandon's achievements." And me? I published my first piece in Paper and Bone that Christmas Eve, a short story titled The Windowless Basement, about a girl living in a family where no one said her name, no one heard her even though she lived among them. Within 3 weeks, the piece was being shared across literary forums. But in Greenville, my mother just asked over the phone, "What's this about a basement? Who reads depressing stuff like that? You should find a real job already." I didn't answer. I stayed quiet, like I had thousands of times before. At 28, I published my first book, a collection of short stories, fragments of people forgotten or overlooked within their own families. The New York Review of Books called it hauntingly sharp. I received an invitation to speak at a young authors conference in Toronto, but when I called home to share the news, Mom said one sentence: "Stop fussing over such silly things. Brandon's getting engaged. Can you make it home in time?" I didn't go. I sent a gift. An original painting by an artist I had once collaborated with for Brandon and his fiancée. Dad called and asked, "Did you paint this?" I said, "No," he chuckled. "Even worse, spent money on something to collect dust on the wall." Then, silence. I started to realize, to them, no matter what I achieved, I would always be that girl who writes things that don't make money. Every success was credited to luck, or worse, to stubbornness. My aunt, Mom's younger sister, once texted me privately, "I read your piece in last month's magazine. I didn't tell your mom. She wouldn't care. But I want you to know it was beautiful and real." I read that message over and over for a week. New York gave me opportunity, but it didn't erase the hollow space inside. I still ate dinner alone, still caught myself pausing in front of store windows, thinking, I wish Mom had once called me gifted. Then one day, I got an email from an independent film producer. They wanted to buy the rights to The Windowless Basement. They said it reminded them of their own childhood, and they believed audiences needed to see it. I said yes. And for the first time, I thought, maybe I didn't need my family's recognition to exist. But deep down, I still wished that one day, just once, my mother would look up my name on Google. Not out of doubt, but to finally understand I was never a failure. I just succeeded in a way she never imagined. I began living two lives, one as Athena Moore on Green Street in the heart of Manhattan, where I was mentioned in literary panels, invited to speak at prestigious universities, and whispered about in publishing circles as the writer who gave silence a voice in America. And the other Athena, the daughter with a job no one understands from Greenville, still called the most stubborn girl in the Moore family by my mother, still seated at the far corner of the table next to the fake flower vase when I came home. When the Southern Mirror named me the most influential female writer under 35 in the Eastern U.S., I told no one in the family. I clipped the article, pressed it into my notebook, and shut it. I had grown used to silence, to speaking up only to be shut down, as if my success was something temporary, a little sideshow while the whole family celebrated Brandon's promotion to assistant manager of a gym chain in Charlotte. My debut book, The Windowless Basement, sold 60,000 copies in 10 months. The publisher ordered a second print. Critics called me a challenger of apathy with visionary prose. A professor from Brown emailed asking to add the book to their curriculum. An Emmy-winning actress said on national TV, the book felt like reading my own story, line by line. I still said nothing to my mother, not out of anger, but because I'd stopped expecting anything. What I feared most was that if I told her, she'd just chuckle and say, "Well, Brandon was on TV last week promoting his gym." I'd rather keep this joy whole and untouched than trade it for her indifference. Then one afternoon in March, my phone rang. An unknown number from Los Angeles I picked up. A male voice introduced himself as Andrew LeBlanc, a producer who had worked with A24. They wanted to adapt The Windowless Basement into a feature film. The director would be someone who had won at Sundance. I sat frozen for nearly a minute, speechless. After the call ended, I broke down in tears. Not because I was shocked, but because for the first time, someone outside my family saw the value I'd been quietly fighting to preserve. The announcement came a week later. Online media lit up. I received nearly 300 emails in 2 days, including one from an old classmate who once told me in 10th grade, "You write well, but there's no way you'll make a living from it." I still didn't tell my mother. When I returned to Greenville for Thanksgiving, the dinner table looked the same: dry roast turkey, overly salted pumpkin soup, and a sheet cake with the words, "Congrats, Brandon, for being invited to speak at the state fitness conference." I didn't see anything wrong with it. Honestly, I had stopped hoping anyone in the house would ask how I was really doing. I vaguely said I was editing a few manuscripts for a publisher, then changed the subject when my mother asked, "Still in that tiny little upstairs place?" That night, I sat in my old room, now painted beige and used for storing winter coats, laptop open, replying to the producer about the official announcement schedule. They wanted me at the premiere event in Toronto next fall. Flight and hotel were booked. I didn't sleep. I sat up nearly till dawn, thinking about everything I had endured, every time I was told I wasn't good enough, every cold stare when I shared my dream, every harmless comment that rooted itself deep within me. I didn't write those stories to prove anything to them, but clearly my silence, intentional or not, had become a kind of power. No need to scream for acknowledgement, just do the work, and do it so well they have no choice but to come looking for your name. 3 weeks later, I received an invitation from The New Yorker. They wanted to publish my new short story in their special issue featuring female writers under 40. I signed the contract within 15 minutes. I didn't call home. I kept it all for myself. I still remember that moment as vividly as if it happened just last night. Brandon's engagement dinner was held at a vintage-style restaurant in downtown Greenville. Once an old train station renovated with chandeliers hanging from high wooden ceilings, crisp white tablecloths, and crystal wine glasses glimmering under candlelight. My mother, Helen Moore, arrived in a deep burgundy dress, hair in a high bun, her mouth stretched into a constant social smile. She poured wine for each guest as if she were the main character, not her son or his fiancée. I sat at a side table near the window, right next to the wine service station. Typical. Still Athena, doing something with books up in New York? Familiar enough to be invited, not important enough to sit near the center. Chloe, Brandon's fiancée, was the only one who made me feel at ease. She had studied humanities at the University of North Carolina and now worked as a brand strategy consultant in Atlanta. Smart, warm, and genuinely seemed interested in knowing me beyond just being Brandon's little sister. When the main course was served, conversation filled the room. My mom was talking endlessly about the wedding plans. "Brandon just got nominated for Young Leader of the Year. Chloe's one lucky girl," she said to the whole table, laughing like she was hosting a live TV show. Chloe turned to me, tilting her head gently. "Athena, I heard you live in Manhattan, right? Where do you work?" Brandon just said something in publishing. I had just opened my mouth when my mother cut in, holding her wine glass. "She does something with books, some little magazine nobody reads, nothing major." I froze. Right then, her voice echoed in my head. Nothing major. In a room full of people toasting Brandon, the same Brandon who once couldn't tell the difference between its and its, I was boxed into the one doing things no one cares about. I put down my knife and fork, about to say something, when Chloe dipped slightly below the table. I saw her grab her phone, scrolling quickly. Her smiling face shifted to confused, then stunned. She looked at me, then back at the screen. A second later, she pushed her chair back slightly, her voice not loud, but clear enough for the main table to hear. "Wait. Athena Moore. You're that Athena Moore. The author of The Windowless Basement, right? The one who just signed a deal with Blue Coast Pictures?" The whole table fell silent. I could feel every head turn, every eye on me. Brandon furrowed his brow. My dad looked up from his plate. My mother stood frozen, as if the blood had drained from her face. Chloe held up her phone, angling it toward Brandon. "You didn't tell anyone your sister was this well-known. I read that book in a reading group at school. We analyzed her prose for several sessions." Brandon stared at me, wide-eyed. "Athena, Is that true? I nodded slowly, quietly. My mother snatched the phone from Chloe's hand, stared at the screen. I could see the book cover clearly, the New York Times article, the headline, "The Voice of Silence, Athena Moore and the Lives We Forget." She forced a smile. Must be someone with the same name. No way. It's not a coincidence, Chloe replied, her voice soft but firm. That's her photo in the interview, and there's even a video of her receiving the Penn Award. Brandon looked lost. My dad stared at me like he was seeing his daughter without the "girl who writes" label for the first time. I looked at my mother. She placed the phone down on the table, her hand slightly trembling. Then she said in a tone I'd heard 1,000 times before, but that now sounded strangely hollow, "If that's really you, why didn't you tell me? Why hide this from the family?" I clenched my hands in my lap, meeting her eyes in silence. Chloe whispered, "Maybe because no one ever asked." The air in the room thickened, as if someone had sealed off every exit. Everything seemed to freeze. Even the sound of silverware on plates vanished. Only my mother's eyes remained fixed on me, her face stretched tight like a violin string pulled to its limit. I looked straight into her eyes, no longer avoiding anything. "It's not that I didn't mention it, Mom. It's that you never listened." My dad cleared his throat, as if about to step in, but I continued. Each word landed like a cut, sharp but no longer angry. The anger had long passed, only memories remained. When I was 12, I won first place in the county-wide writing contest. I brought the certificate home, laid it on the kitchen table. "You brushed it aside," and said you had to take Brandon to baseball practice the next morning. My dad furrowed his brow. Maybe he didn't remember. Maybe he never even knew. The summer of 10th grade, I applied to the Duke writing camp, full scholarship. You forbade me from going, said I needed to focus on math if I wanted to follow in Brandon's footsteps. She stayed silent. Her hand gripped her wine glass tighter, nails pressing into the stem like she might crush it. I sent my first manuscript to a small press. They agreed to publish it. You called it a waste of time. When I got published in Paper and Bone, I called home. You hung up and told me to get real. I turned to my dad. "Dad, do you remember when I mailed 2 copies of my book to the house? With a handwritten card? It was before Christmas 3 years ago." He blinked several times, then slowly shook his head. Mom said probably some junk, left it in the living room for 3 weeks, then stuffed it in a box under the stairs. I came home and found the package still sealed, shipping label and all. Silence blanketed the dinner table. Brandon stared at me, a mix of surprise and confusion in his eyes. You used to say you liked writing, but I didn't think you were that serious." I gave a slight smirk. "You never asked." He dropped his gaze, hands curling into fists. "Everyone always said I was the center, the pride of the Moore family. The only daughter got called the stubborn one, the girl with weird hobbies. I was never the priority, Brandon, not once." My mom set her glass down and stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That's enough. Digging up old things like we were villains. This family gave you everything we could." "Not love," I cut in. "Not recognition. You never saw me as a person of real worth. To you, I was a mistake to be corrected." My dad still said nothing, but his eyes lowered. He was listening, maybe for the first time. Brandon pushed his chair back and stood. "Wait. Maybe you're right. I was the golden one. I always got the praise. But I didn't know it was this deep. If I had known, I would have been different." I turned to look at him. "I don't need your guilt. I just need people to know." Chloe, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I've read your work. I know what you write about, not just the characters, but the feeling of being ignored, being pushed to the edge by your own family, and now I understand why." My mom looked at Chloe as if betrayed. "You think I'm a bad mother too?" Chloe didn't respond. She simply placed a hand gently on Brandon's, like a reminder that truth doesn't need to be cruel. It just needs to be seen. I took a deep breath. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just don't want to keep suffocating every time I come home. I don't want to sit at the side table, telling half-truths just to avoid being dismissed. My dad finally spoke. He stood up, removed his glasses, eyes red. I'm sorry, I've let you live in silence for far too long. No one said anything else, but something had shifted. As I looked around, I didn't see victory, only the truth finally brought into the light after years in the dark. The dinner didn't end with a toast. It ended with a strange silence, not suffocating, but open, like a door left slightly ajar, waiting for someone brave enough to walk through. 3 days after the engagement dinner, a strange package appeared at the door of my Brooklyn apartment. No return address, just a scribbled note in ballpoint. For Athena Moore, don't throw away. I opened it. Inside was a paperback copy of The Windowless Basement, the reprint edition, now with a praise quote from the New York Times, and an old brown notebook. On the first page, a familiar line. Athena, I read it, twice, and the second time, I realized what I'd missed. I froze. It was my father's handwriting. I'm sorry I didn't listen. Not because I didn't love you, but because I was too used to peace and forgot that sometimes peace is just toxic silence. I promise to read everything you write, even the parts that hurt. I sat on my living room floor, clutching the notebook to my chest like armor, tears falling for no specific reason. How do you even explain the feeling of someone finally reading not just your words, but the wounds they carried? Less than a week later, Brandon called. You free? Chloe and I want to ask you for a wedding favor. I hesitated. What is it? He paused. Would you read something at the ceremony? Just a short piece. Something you've written about family or forgiveness. We think it'd mean something. I didn't answer right away. The invitation caught me off guard, gentle and strangely tender. At last I said, if Mom agrees. Brandon exhaled, clearly expecting the question. She's still tense, but Dad's talking to her, and Chloe made her join next month's book club. First pick is The Weight of Dust. Remember that one? Your short story about the dad who didn't know how to say, I love you? I couldn't help but laugh. She's actually reading it? She said. Might as well see what kind of nonsense the girl's been writing that has everyone raving. Brandon chuckled. She's still stiff, but I think she's starting to bend. 2 weeks later, I got an email from Chloe. Subject, reading proposal draft. Attached was the wedding outline. My segment right after the candle lighting ceremony. A short piece, no more than 3 minutes, in front of over 200 guests, mostly relatives and friends who only knew me as Brandon's sister. I rewrote it 3 times, tore up 4 versions, and finally decided not to pull anything from a published piece. I wrote something new, unreleased, unseen. Family is the first place we learn to be silent, but it can also be the first place we learn how to listen again. Some wounds don't need instant forgiveness. They just need to be acknowledged. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do for each other is to begin again, without pretending nothing ever happened. 3 days before the wedding, Mom called. I flinched when I saw her name on the screen. Since that dinner, she hadn't reached out, not even when my interview hit the front page of the Atlantic's culture section. Athena, I won't drag this out. I'm reading the first book. It's not easy, but something in it keeps making me stop. I waited, but she said nothing more. I replied carefully, I didn't write for forgiveness, Mom. You know that. She cut in, and I'm not reading to judge you. There was a pause, then her voice softened. I'll be there when you read at the wedding, but please, no more stories about cold mothers, okay? I laughed, no promises. The wedding took place on a mild spring day, under golden sunlight near Seneca Lake. I stepped up to the wooden podium, paper trembling slightly in my hands, and looked out at the rows of guests. Dad sat beside Mom. She wore a pale blue dress, her hair softer than usual, a printed copy of my piece on her lap. Her head was up. She looked at me. For the first time in my life, Mom looked at me, not through the lens of expectation, not as Brandon's sister, but as someone worthy of being heard. And I began to read. No more fear. No more hiding. This time, my voice rang clear. Not because I needed to be accepted, but because I had accepted myself long ago. The wedding reception was held at Maple and Birch, a restaurant with high ceilings, warm amber lights, and long white linen-covered tables lining windows that looked out into a forest dressed in autumn leaves. Unlike past gatherings, I wasn't seated near the wall or next to the service station. On the printed seating chart, my name was at the center table. Athena Moore, author. Beneath it, Chloe's special request. I stood quietly before the board, not because I was surprised, but because for the first time in my life, someone had publicly recognized me for who I truly was. Mom sat at the next table, beside my aunt and a few old friends from the church women's group. When I walked over, she looked up. No avoidance, no condescension. She tilted her head slightly, nudged the seat beside her, and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "You should sit here, close to family." Dad nodded and poured me a glass of white wine. "Our Athena is the star today," he smiled, his eyes gleaming with a quiet pride I had never seen in all my 32 years. Before I could respond, Aunt Linda, who had always been the most distant toward me, leaned in. "Did you really write The Windowless Basement? My friend from book club said it was brilliant. That girl in the story reminded her of someone." The comment made my mother pause for a beat, but instead of stiffening or changing the subject, she smiled. Not quite comfortably, but without denial. "Inspiration," she said, stirring her lemonade gently. My girl's had a vivid imagination since she was little. For the first time, she called me my girl, without a sigh or a weary glance. Just that. Simple, unguarded. And in that moment, I knew the old walls were beginning to crack, piece by piece. After dinner, Brandon and Chloe each gave their thanks to the guests. Then Brandon turned to me, microphone in hand. "And we want to give a special thank you to Athena Moore, my sister, whom I'm not only proud to call family, but also one of the most powerful writers I've ever read." The room erupted in applause. Chloe stood and added, "And if you haven't read Athena's work yet, brace yourselves. What she writes will pull up every scar you thought you'd buried." I wasn't used to applause, but this time, I didn't want to vanish. I lifted my head, smiled, and gave a small bow. Not out of formality, but out of real, full-hearted gratitude. Then something I never expected happened. My mother walked up to the stage. Slowly, with no notes, no introduction. She took the microphone and looked directly at me. "As Athena's mother, I'd like to say a few words." The room fell silent. To be honest, I didn't understand my daughter. I thought writing was a passing phase. I thought if no one in our family had ever done it, it couldn't be something worth pursuing. She paused, swallowing hard. But I read her work, and I cried. Not out of anger, but because I saw myself on every page. I froze. Everything around me blurred. You don't need me to apologize, but I'll say it anyway. I was wrong not to see you sooner, and if I could go back, I'd be the first in line for a signed copy. Applause erupted, and in that moment, I didn't feel like a shadow anymore. I was Athena Moore, seen not for my accomplishments, but because finally they truly saw me. After the party, Dad walked me to my car. Just before I got in, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm reading The Weight of Dust, only on chapter 4, but chapter 2 kept me up all night." I squeezed his hand, nodding gently. On the drive home, I didn't play music. I let the wind rush through the window and my thoughts settle. I hadn't written to be accepted, but the feeling of being seen, for real, was something I never imagined I'd have, and now I did. No more words were needed. Athena's story is proof that silence doesn't always come from weakness. It often comes from being used to not being heard. But when you step out of the shadow of dismissal and firmly follow your own voice, eventually, even those who once ignored you are forced to take notice. Success isn't about revenge. It's about showing that true worth exists, even when it's overlooked, even when no one says your name. What do you think about Athena's journey? Have you ever been in a similar situation? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more honest, moving, and meaningful stories about family and life.